This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the thumb was engineered, the foot was deviled, and the Peter was black, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder what a basket chair is? Or why Watson's medicine of choice is always brandy? Or what a coal scuttle is and why cigars would be there?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 202, Child Psychology. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we talk about some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you always approach this with a childlike innocence every week.
Well, I have that with me all the time thanks to these containers of Play-Doh I travel with.
You know, I used to like to get high with Play-Doh when I was a child. Not the clay, the philosopher. It was amazing. Amazing. Well, if you would like the show notes for this episode, you can find them at ihose.co/trifles202. That'll take you to our website, SherlockHolmesPodcast.com, where you can leave us a comment on this show, perhaps see some of the links if we share any, and any other supporting material. We do appreciate you being a supporter of the show, whether it's on PayPal or Patreon. You can do it for as little as $1 a month, and that goes toward helping us to pay for the expenses, email and web hosting and sound file hosting and all the rest as we put on this unique form of Sherlockian entertainment for you. Please make sure you subscribe via whatever method works for you. Could be email, could be a podcast catcher, whatever, so you don't miss a single episode. We are here every Wednesday, and we put out 52 episodes a year. And we've got a big announcement coming up in, 2 episodes. So stay tuned for that in episode 204. Now, let's get on with the show. Well, I wanted to talk about child psychology. And, it seems to me, Burt, that we don't see too many children in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And when we do, there is a certain, shall we say, set of consequences that accompanies those children or the people around them, the adults in their lives. And it's interesting because as much as we hear from people over on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere of getting their start with Sherlock Holmes as children, sometimes as young as 8 or 9 years old, but typically in their early teen years, the Sherlock Holmes stories are really devoid of a lot of children.
Well, I think that's reflective of the Victorian time. There really was nothing like, in Victorian England, there was nothing like childhood that we have today. That's very much, at least in my opinion, a 20th century concept. But for the wealthy, obviously we're talking about Victorian England where there's great distinctions in social classes. But for wealthy families, and Holmes frequently comes in contact with well-off families, if you were a child in that sort of environment, you were constantly pushed and prodded to be proper and polite. And there wasn't a lot of parent-to-child communication. There wasn't, and for poor Victorian children, there was work. There was working to survive. And so the things that we consider today associated with childhood, those are all early 20th century sorts of inventions, Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh, and the idea of childhood being a special time. Victorian kids didn't have a lot of toys. They had dolls they made themselves. They had, unless you were a very well-off family, like a princess who could afford a very elaborate doll's house and so on.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And that's one of the reasons why there's so many governesses. Well, in addition to the fact that the literary agents' sisters were governesses, if you were a parent of a child in this age, and you had the resources, your goal would be to hire somebody to do the child rearing. Oh, this is inconvenient. Little Wilhelmina seems to be always beavering about the kitchen. I think we need a nanny, don't you?
Makes great sense. And when you think about that kind of detachment most Victorian parents had from their children, it was not uncommon. And, it strikes me, as interesting that conversation that Sherlock and Mycroft had in the very first scene when we meet Mycroft. He gestures to Holmes and Watson to go over toward the window in the strangers' room of the Diogenes Club, and they're looking down on the street. And Watson says there were two men who stopped out opposite the window. Some chalk marks over the waistcoat pocket were the only signs of billiards which I could see in one of them, as Holmes identified one of them as a billiard marker and the other. And Holmes observed, he said, an old soldier, I perceive. And very recently discharged, remarked his brother. Served in India, I see. A non-commissioned officer. Royal Artillery, I fancy. And a widower. Ah, but with a child. Children, my dear boy, children. And they go on to explain that he's in mourning. He's got a black armband there. He's lost someone very dear to him. The fact that he's doing his own shopping looks as though it were his wife. He's been buying things for children, you perceive. There's a rattle, which shows one of them is very young. The wife probably died in childbed. The fact that he has a picture book under his arm shows that there is another child to be thought of. So there's an instance right there of, a family man, obviously not having the ability to hire a governess, taking care of his own family, and getting a couple of minor trinkets there for his children. Certainly nothing extensive, no blocks or toys or anything like that, but just a gesture of a father toward his children.
Yeah, and there are occasionally those gestures appear elsewhere in the canon. For example, Neville St. Clair and his box of child's bricks. But it's interesting that in that particular case, we never ever see the child except for that remote connection to that particular artifact that wound up at the scene of this great event. But the other thing we should mention, particularly talking about child psychology in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, is the Baker Street Irregulars. Now, admittedly, the 1890s are not the 1840s, so you can't draw too many direct lines between the situation of the Baker Street Irregulars, those street urchins, and Oliver Twist as an example, Dickensian time. But the fact is that there were a lot of children living on the street in alleys and side streets in Victorian England, and many of them were orphans, but many of them came from alcoholic families where they were escaping or getting away from abuse because, drink was, and other forms of inebriation were, as we see in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, a great issue. And, many, turn to thieving, but in the Baker Street Irregulars, you have a group of children who are useful to Sherlock Holmes because of their energy, the fact that they can go everywhere, the fact that they're largely invisible, the fact that they can bring back information. And they do operate under some sort of structure and organization. And so in general, they're looked upon very beneficially and positively rather than, delving too deeply into what their daily lives might be like. But that's an important element in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, and that's a group of children that are really useful to him.
It is. I mean, that came to mind when you were talking before about parents who were well off enough to have governesses, nannies, etc. And that certainly wasn't everyone. And, it strikes me as kind of a both a parallel and a branching off from what we have today. When you or when I grew up, this was a time when children were allowed to be, shall we say, free range. You were allowed to wander around the neighborhood. Just be home by dark, was the only request. You were confident in the fact that come dinner time, someone would feed you, someone in the neighborhood. And your parents really didn't worry too much. I remember our friend Dan Poznansky said, the first time I went to Cuba, I was 12. I got, he hopped a boat out of Brooklyn when he was 12, sailed down to Cuba and back. And, and I guess his parents were none the wiser. That's a little extreme, but in those days, we were allowed to wander the streets. And now we have helicoptering parents. Kids aren't allowed to be, out of sight or more than 50 feet away from you. And, we've swung to the other extreme. And it seems like we've got both of those extremes in the canon between the well-off children with their, daily lessons from the governesses and their in-house classrooms, as we saw in, the problem of Thor Bridge, versus the irregulars who are literally running all around the city, day and night, tracking down things for Holmes.
Mm. Well, it was never really black and white. I mean, I had very much that sort of childhood that you described. In fact, I grew up, in a very small suburban Pennsylvania town where they still had band concerts at the weekend in the park. But even so, I remember when I was in elementary school that a friend of mine, his young sister, disappeared and was later found murdered in the woods. And that was, just an awful, awful thing, particularly when, you're in a class with a child and, we're talking about, the fourth grade, the fifth grade, something like this is happening. But in those days too, if that story was reported, it was not, you didn't have the instant media,
right,
the technology to alert everyone, the 24/7 news cycle, the desire for clicks and emotion. It was certainly reported in the paper, and I knew about it, and all of the parents, were shocked and commiserating and helpful to the family. But, it didn't become the sort of 15-minute instant disaster that things happened in 2020. Mm.
Well, we have a 1-minute disaster for you here. It's called an ad. Please stay tuned, and we will be back right after this word with more about child psychology in the canon. If you're a regular listener of Trifles, you'll know that we also have another show called I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. And of course, we do hear of Sherlock everywhere around the globe, and it's partially due to the BSI Press. The BSI Press has been doing the international series for well over a decade, and it takes you to places that, you couldn't otherwise go without the BSI Press's help. And that is inside scholarship coming from Sherlockian societies from all corners of the globe. You'll find Japan and Sherlock Holmes, Scandinavia and Sherlock Holmes, Australia, Italy, Spain, Canada. The list continues to grow. So if you're interested in what people from all around the world have to say about Sherlock Holmes, find that common bond at the BSI Press website, BakerStreetIrregulars.com, and pick out an international volume of your choice today. I've wrought my simple plan if I give 1 hour of joy to the boy who's half a man, or the man who's half a boy. Name that quote, Burt Wolder.
Yes. Well, the question with that quote, though, is which half is Conan Doyle talking about?
Yes, that's exactly right. That's Conan Doyle. I think he wrote that for the flyleaf of, or the frontispiece of The Lost World, if I'm not mistaken, in 1912.
Yeah, no, I think you probably are.
So,
well, this is such a great topic in the world of Sherlock Holmes. And early on in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, there's a wonderful indication of how important it is. And it happens in the Copper Beeches. And it's not why you might think of focusing on the Copper Beeches because of weird Edward Rucastle, whom I'm sure we'll talk about. But it's early on in the story where Holmes observes to Watson, he says, "My dear Watson, you as a medical man are continually gaining light as to the tendencies of a child by the study of the parents. Don't you see that the converse is equally valid? I frequently gain my first real insight into the character of parents by studying their children. This child's disposition is abnormally cruel merely for cruelty's sake, and whether he derives this from his smiling father, or, as I should suspect, or from his mother, it bodes evil for the poor girl who is in their power." And, it's that observation that sort of takes me to the more mechanical role of children in the canon, which, is a way of getting from one event to another event or an indicator of what might be really going on, rather than spending any time at all about the actual real personalities or treating very young children in the canon as real people.
That's so interesting because it's in direct parallel to the way Holmes looks at dogs in families, where he said, a dog reflects the family life. Whoever saw a frisky dog in a gloomy family or a sad dog in a happy one? Snarling people have snarling dogs. Dangerous people have dangerous ones. And their passing moods may reflect the passing moods of others. So right there, you've basically got Holmes equating children with dogs. They're the pets of the family. They, as you say, they're not fully formed humans. They are simply indicators along the way for him to glean clues from. And indicators is a great word, and it's a lovely thing too because it's so consistent with and so much amplifies the character of Sherlock Holmes as whom Watson occasionally calls, a cold-blooded reasoning machine. That's not completely true. Yeah, of these stories, these pastiches and other inventions that have been written in the post-Conan Doyle era, where we find Holmes having had children. What kind of a father figure would he be to these children, other than to teach them the way of, the family profession, the way of detection? I can't really see him being that warm,
No, but I can see him turning to his index under H and trying to find the contact information for Violet Hunter to see if she was still available.
Need some help there. Yeah, no doubt. It's strange too, because there's a time in the canon when Watson is almost ready to believe that children are capable of the kind of violence that they come across. It was in The Sign of Four, right? They happen upon Bartholomew Sholto, frozen with his rictus smile, the victim of a poisoned dart. And they look at the floor and they see footprints, and the floor was covered thickly with the prints, Watson writes, of a naked foot, clear, well-defined, perfectly formed, but scarce half the size of those of an ordinary man. "Holmes," I said in a whisper, "a child has done this horrid thing." Now, what on God's green earth would Watson have come across in his life to make him think that a child could have murdered a man like that?
Well, hopefully nothing. Although he has had an interesting set of experiences around the world. But it's a wonderful frisson of terror. That particular moment and that whole visual moment of the child's footprints and what could this possibly indicate. It's just brilliant.
Well, and we're not done with children and poison darts. This, of course, is the central tenet behind what happens in the Sussex Vampire, where we have not only one but two children. We have a baby and a teenager, Master Jackie Ferguson. And it's a house full of South American artifacts. And you recall that the wife, Mrs. Ferguson, is suspected of being a vampire because Big Bob Ferguson barged in, heard the screaming baby, barged into the room, and saw his wife lift her lips up from the baby's neck, and her lips were dripping with blood. Well, of course, spoiler alert, we find out later that this is because she's trying to save the baby, who she has witnessed being tampered with by the older brother, Jackie Ferguson. Jackie, of course, has come across some of these South American curare-tipped arrows and has decided to make sure that his baby brother becomes afflicted, much like Jackie has. He walks with a limp from some childhood injury, and he sees this young and healthy baby, and in his twisted mind believes that that child should not have any more of a chance than he did, and should not have more of his parents' love than he does. And interestingly enough, Holmes is able to deduce what's going on not only by observing the Jackie's face in the reflection of a mirror, seeing the kind of jealousy and rage expressed on his face, but because Jackie experiments on the family dog, who Holmes observes is going lame. And that is frightfully familiar of another canonical tale we've come across.
Yes, very familiar with the events of Silver Blaze. But before we get to Silver Blaze, I just have to say that I think your explanation and description of Jackie's motivations and mental state is better than the one that Sherlock Holmes offers, because you point out and I think, and it's not in conflict with what goes on in Sussex Vampire, but I think it speaks to someone who has observed jealousy among children. And so you have a slightly disabled child who's jealous of a healthy and younger child. And that would be, perfectly reasonable if you were looking at this series of events and coming up with motivations. But what Holmes says is, you have to face it, Mr. Ferguson. It's the more painful because it is a distorted love, a maniacal, exaggerated love for you and possibly for his dead mother, which has prompted his action. His very soul is consumed with hatred for this splendid child whose health and beauty are a contrast to his own weakness. Now that's, that is even for, 1896, that is a little purple. A little purple. But what you were talking about a minute ago was the fact that, if you look at the chronology, and we have that event in the Silver Blaze where the effects of a particular, without getting into any details, that basically a crime is rehearsed by taking, having some experiments done on animals ahead of time. You have that same sort of thing here. And Bill Hyder, among others, I think, has speculated that perhaps young Jackie actually, although how old is Jackie?
Yeah, he's about 15 or 16, I think.
Oh, that's right. So he is in his teen years, yeah. So he could have actually read Silver Blaze and said, let me make a note of that.
Well, maybe he was one of those people that Conan Doyle gave an hour of joy to.
if you got an hour of joy from the cases of Sherlock Holmes, that is certainly not a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
What do you make of him?
The billiard marker and the other.
Precisely. What do you make of the other?
An old soldier, I perceive.
And very recently discharged.
Served in India, I see.
And a non-commissioned officer.
Royal Artillery, I fancy.
And a widower.
With a child.
Children, my dear boy. Children.